In this final video on the French Revolution, we're going to look at mainly the historical figure of Napoleon Bonaparte. And so we're roughly going to look at the period of 1795 until, as we previously sort of said, until he comes to complete power by 1799 within France. But for this section, I want to go back a bit because we need to look at Napoleon in terms of his background, where he was born, a bit of his childhood and his education, because all of this leads to a greater understanding of the context of Napoleon Bonaparte, which is the historical context of the world in which he was born, and that he will play such a vital role from the year 1799 until 1815. He plays such an extraordinary role in these events that, as your book says, this period is known as the Age of Napoleon. Yet the book only spends about 3 pages on his rule. So I want to give a much deeper understanding of Napoleon than the textbook gives. And so one of my own questions that I want you to think about is how his background, how his as we'll see, his Corsican background, what role does this play, do you think, in how he came to rule France and his own empire? I mean, this man will come to rule almost the entirety of the continent of Europe at the height of his power in 1811, 1812. And so I want you to think about that. I also want you to think about the question that's posed here on page 482. That says, which aspects of the French Revolution did Napoleon preserve and which did he destroy? So there are going to be those ideas of the revolution that he not only continues in France, but that he continues or brings to his empire. That is to say that every state or country that he conquers, he brings many of the ideas of the French Revolution to those government structures and to the people of those countries. And so, there are a number of things on the positive that make life for the average person within, say, many of the Italian republics or the Holy Roman Empire. It makes their lives better under the rule of Napoleon. And yet there are those things which he does under his rule that perhaps make things worse for some people. One of the things that, of course, he does that spreads the ideas of the revolution are the ideas of basically destroying the privileges of all nobility and clergy. And this is something for which, certainly at first, many people who find themselves under the new French Empire love about Napoleon. And so he brings that part of, which we've kind of looked at as really the seeds of the French Revolution, was about the resentment of the Third Estate against the First and Second Estate, and Napoleon goes about destroying those ideas within all of the areas he conquers. And he goes about creating, to a large degree, in France and the areas that he conquers, a meritocracy. That is, a government structure based on the ability of a certain individual. In other words, he does not go by class or title, or even, say, within the army, for which, as we'll discuss, he is a part of. He would not, for instance, put someone who graduated from a fancy military college over someone who had fought in battle with him, showed courage, showed bravery, or perhaps had done some extraordinary feat in battle. He would rather have that person he knows is talented and brave on the battlefield, as an officer. And those people can rise from the lowest ranks all the way up to the positions of, say, a general. Under the old regime, that would have been impossible. Napoleon makes that completely possible. So, on one hand, the areas that he will conquer, he will do mass conscription, meaning he will force large percentages of the male population to join his own army and fight for him, which maybe is viewed as oppressive, and yet at the same time they will get many of the rights and liberties that are guaranteed under these ideas of the revolution. So there's no easy answer. It's very much an interpretation, and I leave it up to you to ultimately decide: was Napoleon the bearer of the French Revolution, or did he simply want to extend his own power throughout Europe or the world? And I leave that, again, up to you. I will present you first, though, with a quote from a very well-known and popular historian named Andrew Roberts, who writes on Napoleon. He has written a book recently titled Napoleon the Great, basically arguing that we should refer to Napoleon, or he should have been known, or should be known, as Napoleon the Great, much like we've seen in the past Catherine the Great or Frederick the Great or so on. And he asked this question: well, what did Napoleon give to the world? Why should he be known as great? After all, a lot of people think of Napoleon Bonaparte as a warmonger, someone who wanted to conquer for his own vanity. But he says, in sort of retaliation to this, he says, quote, "The ideas that underpin our modern world, meritocracy, equality before the law, property rights, religious toleration, modern secular education, sound finances, and so on, were championed, consolidated, codified, and geographically extended by Napoleon. To them he added a rational and efficient local administration, an end to rural banditry, the encouragement of science and the arts, and the abolition of feudalism and the greatest codification of laws since the fall of the Roman Empire." Sound like a lot for one person to do? Well, yes. But as we'll see, there's no doubt that Napoleon was not only highly talented in a number of fields, but he was without a doubt a genius. He had the mind of a genius. He was able to sort of compartmentalize his mind to focus on any number of things all at once. So yes, he was, if you only sort of know Napoleon in terms of, wasn't he that, great military leader or strategist? Yes, he was. But he was able to do many more things in terms of ruling over a vast empire. So, in the last part of this video, then I want to just look a little bit about Napoleon's upbringing. It begins 20 years before the French Revolution. He was born exactly 20 years before the revolution began in 1769. But he was not born in France. In fact, he was not French at all. He was Corsican. He was born on the island of Corsica, which is in the Mediterranean, above the island of Sardinia, and below the south coast of France. They did not speak French. In fact, they spoke their own dialect of Corsican, but it was heavily influenced by the Italian language. Therefore, Napoleon was far more Italian than he was French. And, well, that might have something to do with who the man he ultimately became. He was born in many ways. He was born at the right time in the right place. And this will kind of happen again and again with Napoleon, leading him to believe that he was being sort of guided by destiny to a great position. Because basically, in the year he was born, Corsica went from a small, relatively small island nation that was under the control of the Italian province of Genoa to a French colony. And many of the people, including his family, his parents, resented the French for what they did, which is basically come to control the island. However, to sort of create, I guess, peaceful terms with the natives, if you will, the French offered certain parts of the Corsican society to have their own nobility. And Napoleon's father was one of these people who was given a title. Therefore, he was given it was a French title. Napoleon would be, and his many sisters and brothers would be afforded a, say, position in life, education, and future position in, say, the military, French military, which many others, even within France, would not have been under the old regime. And so Napoleon was born under certain circumstances. Although he grew up, like many Corsicans, to hate the French for what they saw as them taking over their country, he did have a great respect for many of the French philosophers we've talked about, the Enlightenment thinkers. Napoleon Bonaparte would ultimately be an enlightened monarch. And it is in this way that while he was an avid reader, his teachers noted him for having excelling in things like mathematics and history and geography. And so, at a very young age, Corsican, with this thick Corsican accent, he ultimately was allowed to be sent to France to be trained, basically in the greatest or the best military schools in France. Why? Because his father was technically a noble, which meant he was technically a noble. But he would find during his early education that he was bullied very heavily because these little French noble kids with their certain French ways made fun of him endlessly, because not because he was necessarily short, which many people say about Napoleon, but because he had this thick Corsican accent, and he just was simply different than the other kids. So we'll pick up there in the second video.